My name is Faye Phillips, and I'm 42 years old. The last Christmas I spent with my family, my mother stood up at the table and asked everyone to help my sister, because poor Faye has nothing, but Colleen still has a future. 18 relatives nodded. My father wouldn't look at me. My sister smiled into her wine. They wanted me to sell my farm and hand over whatever I could scrape together to save the golden child one more time. What they didn't know was that I'd already sold it. Days earlier, quietly, and that I'd just spent a week learning exactly what they'd done to get to that table. I said nothing. I just waited for my aunt to open her folder. Before I go any further, if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, take a second to like and subscribe so it can reach someone else who needs it tonight. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read them all. I'm Faye. This is the story of the family that decided what I was worth, and the winter I finally stopped letting them. Let me take you back to where it started, to a piece of land everyone told me was worthless. To understand that Christmas, you have to understand what I was to my family long before that night. Not a daughter, exactly. Something steadier and colder than that. A fixed point they could lean their whole weight against and trust would never move. I grew up in a small town south of Nashville, in a house my grandfather built with his own hands. My sister Colleen came along when I was 4. She was the soft one, the pretty one, the one who cried easily and got held. I was the one who didn't cry. I learned early that not needing anything was the only gift my parents actually wanted from me. When I was 9, the strap on my school bag tore. I asked my mother if we could fix it. She was busy with Colleen that afternoon. Some small fever, some small worry. So I sat on the back steps and sewed it shut myself, with fishing line, because that's what we had in the drawer. She found me there an hour later and smiled like I'd done something wonderful. "You're my easy one," she said. "I never have to worry about you." I thought that was love. It took me 30 years to understand it was an assignment. Colleen got a new backpack that fall. I remember it had daisies on it. Nobody thought that was strange, least of all me. That was just the water we swam in. Colleen needed things, and needing was how she got held. I managed, and managing was how I got left alone. There's 100 small moments like that I could tell you. The year I had strep and rode my bike to the clinic myself because Colleen had a recital. The time my father drove 4 hours to move my sister into a dorm, and forgot he'd promised to help me carry a used couch up my own stairs the same week. I carried it alone. I got good at alone. I told myself it was strength. By the time I finished high school, I already knew I wanted land. Not for any grand reason. I just liked the quiet of it. The way work out in the open made sense in a way people never did. So at 18, I started working ranches and hay crews, and I picked up night shifts at a feed warehouse in town, hauling 50-pound bags until my hands cracked, and I saved every dollar I didn't spend on rent and gas. I did that for 8 years. I remember one night at the warehouse, near the end of a double, sitting on a pallet with a sandwich I was too tired to eat, and a coworker asking me what I was saving so hard for. I told him, "Land." He laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Girls like you don't buy land." I finished my shift. I bought the land anyway, but I remembered that too. Girls like you. I think about that phrase sometimes. All the people over the years who told me what a girl like me could and couldn't have. A high school counselor who steered me toward the secretarial track. A banker who almost didn't take my loan application seriously until I laid my savings statement on his desk. My own father, at his own table. None of them were cruel about it. That was the strange part. They just seemed to know, the way you know the weather, what a girl like me was worth. And I let them think it. Because arguing cost energy I needed for the work, and because being underestimated I was learning, leaves you free to move. In 2009, when I was 26, I bought 360 acres of pasture and hay ground about 40 minutes from town. It was mostly a bank's money. I sat in a small office with fake wood paneling and signed for a loan of $1.1 million, and my hand shook so badly on the last page that the loan officer asked if I needed a minute. I said no. I lay awake for a week afterward, sick with the size of it, doing the math over and over in the dark. When I told my family, my sister laughed at me. "You bought dirt," she said, "with debt." God, Faye. My father shook his head like I'd embarrassed him at a party. My mother said she just hoped I knew what I was doing, in the tone she used when she'd already decided I didn't. Nobody asked why I'd chosen that particular stretch of ground, 40 minutes out, where the county had already started buying easements to widen the road. Nobody asked anything. It was easier to decide I was reckless. Reckless was a story they already knew how to tell. So that became the story. Faye threw her money in the dirt. For the next 16 years, I lived like a woman who had nothing, because on paper, I nearly did. Every dollar the farm made went back into the farm, or to the bank, or to the next winter's feed. I drove a 2003 Ford with a door that stuck, and a heater that only worked if you hit the dash in the right spot. I wore the same barn coat every winter until the pocket tore, and then I pinned it shut with a safety pin and kept wearing it. I cut my own hair some years. I ate what I grew and fixed what broke and learned to weld so I wouldn't have to pay someone. To my family, that settled it. My truck was proof. My coat was proof. My rough hands and my chapped face were proof. They looked at all of it and saw a woman who had failed, and it never once occurred to them to ask what the land under my boots might one day be worth. There were hard years in there. A drought that killed a cutting of hay. A winter a barn roof went down under ice, and I spent 3 days rebuilding it in the cold, alone, because I couldn't afford a crew. I called my father once that winter, not for money, just to hear a voice. He asked, before I'd said anything real, whether I'd finally come to my senses about selling. I said no. He said, well, and there wasn't much after that. I didn't call again for a long time, and there were a lot of Christmases I couldn't make, because a cow doesn't stop calving because it's December. When a heifer's in trouble at 2 a.m. on the 24th, you don't leave her in the dark to drive to town. You stay. Every time I stayed, my father filed it away as one more sign that I loved my animals more than my family. "You always pick the cows over us," he'd say. It wasn't that. I'd have given a lot to be wanted at that table, but wanting isn't the same as being asked, and no one ever really asked. There was one Christmas Eve, I must have been 35, when I sat on an overturned bucket in the barn with my arm still warm from helping a calf into the world, and I looked out the open door at the neighbor's house across the field, all strung with lights, a family moving behind the windows. My phone had one message on it. It was my mother, asking if I could bring a ham next time, since I wasn't coming. That was the whole message. Bring a ham. It wasn't that I picked the cows. It was that no one ever picked me. The thing I understood latest, the thing I wish I'd understood at 26, is what I actually was to them. I found out by accident, standing in the kitchen doorway at a family gathering when I was around 30. My mother was talking to one of my aunts, not knowing I was close enough to hear over the sink. "If anything ever happens," she said, "we know Faye will step up. She's the strong one." She said it warmly. Proudly, even. And for 1 second, I felt proud too, standing there in that doorway. Then I understood. I wasn't the strong one because they admired my strength. I was the strong one because it meant they never had to give me anything, and because they were keeping me in reserve. I was the family's insurance policy, the daughter you don't spend on, so she's there in full when the one you do spend on finally falls. I backed out of that doorway before anyone saw me. I didn't say a word about it for years. I just didn't know yet what it would cost me the day they came to collect. And they were spending. That was the part I couldn't see clearly for a long time, because the shine coming off my sister was so bright it blinded everyone, including me. Colleen did everything the way my parents wanted a life to look. She married a man named Grant Ward when she was 26, a mortgage broker with a good handshake and better shoes. She opened a home and styling boutique she called Willow and Sage. She bought a house in Brentwood with tall windows and a lawn service, and a kitchen island the size of my truck bed. She had my niece Nora, and she filled the internet with photographs of all of it. The kind where everything is cream-colored and folded and nothing has ever actually been used. Now, that's a life, my mother told me once, standing in Colleen's spotless kitchen at Thanksgiving. Why can't you want that, Faye? I didn't answer. I was looking out the window at the leased Range Rover in the driveway, parked at an angle next to my muddy truck, and thinking that in 3 years of my sister owning that shop, I had never once seen a customer inside it. That was the thing only I seemed to notice. The boutique was always about to take off. For years, it was always finding its feet, always one good season away, always a soft launch or a rebrand or a pop-up that was going to change everything. Meanwhile, my father started selling off pieces of his portfolio quietly, the way a man does when he doesn't want to be asked why. My mother got vague and bright whenever money came up at the table, which was the surest sign in the world that something was wrong underneath it. I went by the shop once, on a weekday, because I happened to be in town. The lights were on. Colleen was behind the counter on her phone. There was a lot of beautiful, expensive nothing on the shelves, and no one in the store but her. She saw me and got flustered, and then bright, and she gave me a little tour like I was a customer, and the whole time a part of me wanted to ask gently, "Are you okay?" But we didn't do that in our family, so I said it all looked lovely, and I left. On my way out, I passed my father's car in the lot. I hadn't known he'd be there. I saw a bank envelope on my parents' kitchen counter another time, unopened, and my sister moved it before I could read more than the return address. Harpeth Federal. "Dad's just helping out while the shop finds its feet," she said, too fast, and changed the subject. I filed it away with everything else I noticed and never said out loud. By then I'd stopped going around much. It hurt to be measured against her and come up short every single time, so I let the distance grow between us. And distance is dangerous in a family like mine. The less I was there, the easier it was to tell the story of me without me in the room. Faye's still out there in the mud. Faye never grew up. Faye had her chance, and blew it. They didn't even mean it as cruelty, most of the time. That's what took me so long to understand. They believed it. They needed to believe it. Because if I was the failure, then everything they were pouring into Colleen finally made sense. I was the reason the math worked. I got Nora's 5th birthday invitation 2 days after the party. The postmark showed it had been mailed late. On purpose or not, I never asked. "We didn't invite you because we assumed you'd be busy," my father said when I mentioned it. I said I would have come. He said, "Well," and there it was again. Well, I found out just how much they were pouring in during the same month everything changed. That fall, a man from a company called Cane Ridge Land Partners started calling. His name was Dean Mercer, a commercial broker. Plain-spoken, no charm to waste on anyone. Nashville had been growing south for years, and it had finally reached my county road. A developer was quietly assembling parcels for a large project, and my 360 acres sat right in the middle of everything they wanted. He called 3 times before I called back. The 4th time, I met him out at the farm. "Your land is the keystone, Ms. Phillips," he told me. "They can't build without you. Everyone around you is already circling. You're the one piece they have to have." He spread a parcel map across the hood of my truck, and the wind kept lifting the corner while he talked, and he pointed to the shape of my ground in the middle of it. And then he wrote a number on the edge of that map with a felt pen, and turned it so I could see. I had to sit down on the porch steps, $39 million. For the dirt my sister laughed at. For the debt my father was ashamed of. For the coat with the pinned pocket and the truck with the sticking door and the 2 jobs and the 8 years and the barn roof I rebuilt in the ice, alone. I want to be honest with you about the first thing I felt because it wasn't joy. It was fear. Not of the money, of my family. I knew them. I could see it all before it happened, the way you can see a storm build over open ground. I knew that the second the word got out, I would stop being a person and become a resource. There would be a plan for the money before I'd even understood I had it, and the plan would not include me except as the source. Colleen would need. My parents would explain. And somehow, the way it always went, I would end up feeling guilty for hesitating to give away my own life. I had watched it happen 100 times with smaller things. A tax refund my father simply assumed I'd loan out and was hurt when I didn't. A truck I fixed up that Colleen borrowed and never brought back. Every good thing I ever came into, in my family's hands, turned into a shared resource the moment they learned it existed. $39 million would not be a windfall in that house. It would be a countdown clock, and I would be the one standing under it. So I made a decision that I have never once regretted. I told no one. Not my parents, not my sister, not a neighbor, not a friend, not the man at the feed store who'd known me for 20 years. I took the papers Dean Mercer sent me and I put them in my grandfather's old tin box, the one with the dented lid that had held his tools and then his letters, and I locked it and set it on the top shelf of the pantry, and I let my whole family go on believing I had nothing, while I decided, on my own, in my own time, what my life was going to be. The negotiations took a few weeks. There were surveys, and lawyers on their side, and 100 small signatures. Through all of it, I kept doing chores in the same coat, driving the same truck, saying nothing. The sale closed on an ordinary gray morning that December. The money moved. Dean shook my hand in his office and said, "It's done. Congratulations, Ms. Phillips." He seemed to want me to be happier than I was. I drove home in the truck with the bad heater. I didn't celebrate. There was no one to celebrate with. And that was a grief of its own. But it was also, I was starting to see, a kind of freedom. I walked out into the middle of the field one last time while it was still mine on paper, and I stood there in the cold with my breath hanging in front of me, and I let myself feel the size of what I'd done. 16 years. Half my life. Sold to strangers who would pave it. There was one bar of signal out there. My phone buzzed against my leg. One voicemail. My Aunt Trudy. "Faye, honey," she said, and her voice was careful in a way that made my stomach tighten. "There's something about your dad you need to know. Call me back when you can." I didn't get the chance to call her that night. 3 days later, before I'd even sat with what I'd sold, my family drove out to me. They came in 3 cars, my mother and father in one, Colleen in another. Grant sat in a third in the driveway, engine running, not coming in, which told me almost everything about how this was going to go before anyone said a word. They didn't knock. They came into my kitchen and sat down at the table I'd built myself out of old barnwood, 4 of them around it, and my mother folded her hands on the surface like she was chairing a meeting. "Sit down, Faye," she said. "We need to talk about the family." Colleen's eyes were red and swollen. My mother had the calm, prepared look of a woman who'd rehearsed. My father wouldn't look at me at all. He looked at the old crack in the tabletop, at his own hands, at the window over the sink. Anywhere but at his daughter. My mother laid it out the way you'd explain a chore to a child. Colleen had hit a rough patch. Just temporary. The house was in a little trouble. The shop needed some air, and the family was going to come together. The way families do in hard times. And the sensible thing, the fair thing, was for me to sell the farm and help. "You don't have kids," Colleen said softly, like she was being reasonable. "You don't have much out here anyway. It just makes sense for you to be the one." She said it gently. That was the part that took the wind out of me. There was no cruelty in her face. To her, it was simply obvious. Of course, Faye. Faye has nothing to lose. Faye has always been the one who steps up. She set a piece of paper on my table while she talked, and I saw the top of it before she slid it back toward herself. 2 words, in bold, at the top. Notice of default. Harpeth Federal. So there it was. They were sitting in my kitchen, asking me to sell the one thing they believed I owned in this world, to bail out the daughter they had chosen over me my entire life. And here is the thing I need you to sit with, because it is the thing that changed me all the way through. They still thought I was broke. They believed, with total certainty, that I had nothing but this farm and a bad truck and a torn coat. And believing that, they had gotten in 3 cars and driven 40 minutes out to take even that. To strip me down to the studs and call it love. "This is what family does, Faye," my mother said. "We sacrifice for each other. Your sister would do it for you." We both knew that wasn't true, but she said it, and my father didn't correct her. And Colleen looked at me with wet, waiting eyes. I looked at the 4 of them around my table. I looked at the way their eyes kept moving over my boots and my coat and my hands, finding nothing there worth respecting. And I finally understood, all the way to the floor of me, what I had spent 42 years refusing to understand. If they were willing to take everything from me while they thought I had nothing, then it was never about fairness. It was never even really about need. It was about the simple fact that I was useful and Colleen was loved. And in this house, those 2 things had never once been the same thing. I didn't yell. I didn't tell them what was in the tin box on the top shelf, 20 feet from where they sat. I didn't say a word about Dean Mercer or Cane Ridge or the number that had moved into my account 3 days before. I said the only thing I could trust myself to say: "I'll think about it." They took it as a yes. My mother's shoulders came down. Colleen almost smiled through her tears. My father finally looked at me, just for a second, with something in his face I couldn't read and didn't want to. They stood up and put their coats back on and told me they knew I'd do the right thing, and they filed out to their cars, and I stood at the window and watched 3 sets of taillights bump away down my long dirt road into the dusk. I stood on the porch a while after they were gone, with the cold coming up through the boards, and I understood something all the way down for the first time in my life. They would have taken everything I had and called it love, and I was grateful. Not proud, not vengeful. Grateful, in a bone-deep, quiet way, for the one thing I'd done right. Grateful I'd told no one. If your own family had sat you down at your own table and asked you to give up the one thing you built with your own 2 hands, while still calling you the failure, would you have said yes? Tell me below. I need to know I'm not the only one who sat in that chair. I called Trudy back that night, standing on the porch in the dark, and I finally heard the message she'd been trying to give me. My Aunt Trudy is my father's younger sister. She's 63, and she spent 30 years as a loan officer at a credit union, which means 2 things about her. She understands money better than anyone in my family ever has, and she cannot stand to watch someone get quietly ruined. She drove out the next morning. She brought a thermos of coffee, because that is what Trudy does, and we sat in the cab of my truck with the windows fogging up from our breath, 2 cups going cold in the console between us, and she set a hard-backed folder on her lap and rested both hands on top of it for a moment before she opened it. "I didn't come to ask you for anything, honey," she said. "I want you to hear that first. I came because someone in this family finally should." Then she opened the folder. The first page was a home equity line of credit. Harpeth Federal. $410,000 drawn against my parents' house. The house my grandfather built with his hands, the house that had been paid off free and clear, for 20 years. He put it on the line, Faye, Trudy said, and her voice stayed very steady, which is exactly how I knew she was furious. He put your granddad's house on the line. She'd found out about it because he'd asked her, of all people, to witness some of the paperwork. He'd counted on her not reading it closely because she was family, because she was Trudy, who brought coffee. She read every line. He had taken that $410,000 and moved it, in pieces, into Colleen's accounts over 2 years, to cover the shop's losses, to cover the Brentwood house payments, to cover a life my sister had never once, in all the shine of it, actually been able to afford. I sat there looking at the phrase property pledged as collateral, underlined twice in Trudy's soft pencil, and I felt the ground move under the truck. If the house is mortgaged, I said, and my voice sounded far away to me, then what about his retirement? Trudy turned the page. He'd emptied it. Early withdrawals from his retirement account, going back 2 years, roughly $300,000, each one dinged with a penalty because he was pulling the money out before he was allowed to touch it. A man who had lectured me for 16 years about how I was reckless, how I'd thrown my life into the dirt, had quietly set his own future on fire, penalty by penalty, to keep my sister's shine from going dark for one more season. And Colleen. Trudy had put together what she could of my sister's side of it, from what she'd seen and what my father had let slip. The maxed cards, the business losses, year after year. The second loans. Willow and Sage had never turned a profit. Not one single year it had been open. All in, my sister was somewhere around $680,000 underwater and sinking. They called you reckless with money, Trudy said, and she laughed. But it wasn't a happy sound at all. You. The one who never missed a payment in her life. I did the arithmetic right there in the cab of the truck, with the coffee cold and the windows white with fog. The house, mortgaged. The retirement, gone. Nearly $700,000 in debt on top of it. All of it poured into the daughter they loved, while the daughter they didn't was told she was the disappointment, and then driven out to and asked to sell her land to plug the hole they'd dug. I finally knew exactly how much my family had bet against me, and I knew, sitting there, that they had lost. I'm not going to yell, I told Trudy. I'm not going to make a scene. I'm just going to let the paper talk. I took her folder inside and I set it on the top shelf of the pantry, right next to my grandfather's tin box. 2 stacks of paper, side by side. 2 truths. One they had hidden from everyone, and one I had. I didn't sleep much that week. Not from anger, exactly. It was more like a kind of vertigo. The feeling of a thing you'd stood on your whole life turning suddenly upside down. Because for 16 years I had believed, somewhere underneath everything, that maybe they'd been a little bit right about me. That maybe I really was the reckless one, the foolish one, the one who couldn't be trusted with money. The folder on that top shelf took that last small doubt and closed it for good. I was not the one who had gambled our family away. I had never been. There was one more thing that happened that week, and I need to tell you about it, because without it I might have become someone I didn't want to be. Colleen dropped Nora at the farm for the weekend. She always did that when her life was falling apart. Sent her 9-year-old out to the aunt who supposedly had nothing, because it was free, and because it got the girl out of the house. I never minded. Nora was the only person in my family who had never once learned to look at me and see a failure. She spent that Saturday in her little rubber boots, following the fence line, letting a bottle calf lick her fingers and shrieking with laughter every time its rough tongue caught her. We fed the chickens. We fixed a gate. She talked the whole time about school and her friends and a show she liked, and I listened, and for a few hours the weight of everything on the top shelf lifted off me. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, she stopped by the fence and looked up at me with that straight, unguarded way children have, and she asked me a question no one in my family had asked me in 42 years. "Aunt Faye," she said, "are you sad? You look sad." I had to turn away and pretend to work the latch on the gate so she wouldn't see my face. Not one person in my entire life had ever stood in front of me and asked if I was okay. Not when I worked 2 jobs. Not when I signed for over $1 million alone with my hand shaking. Not when they told the whole family I'd thrown my life away. I was the strong one, and strong ones don't get asked. And here was a 9-year-old girl in muddy boots, asking me, plainly, because she loved me, and it had simply never occurred to her not to. "I'm okay, sweetheart," I told her, when I could trust my voice. "I'm real glad you're here." Before she left, she gave me a drawing she'd made at the kitchen table. It was the farm. Me, standing by my bad truck, 3 lopsided cows, a yellow sun taking up half the sky. Across the top she'd written, in careful 9-year-old letters, "Aunt Faye's happy place." "This is my favorite place in the whole world," she told me, very seriously, and hugged me around the waist. I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet, right over the top of the old family photo that had been curling there for years, the one where I'm standing off at the edge of the frame with mud on my hands and nobody's arm around me. Something settled in me then, looking at that drawing over that photo. I knew, by that point, that I was going to let the truth come out. I knew I was done being anyone's insurance policy, done making myself small so the family math would work. But standing in that kitchen, I made myself a second promise, just as firm as the first. Whatever I did, the little girl was not going to pay for it. I could love her and still refuse to be used. I could draw a hard line with her mother and never once let it fall across the child. Both of those things could be true at the same time. That is the part revenge never leaves any room for. I didn't want to burn my family to the ground. I only wanted to stop being the fuel. The days before Christmas were loud in the way that silence can be loud. My phone never stopped. My mother's texts came in waves, each one a small, practiced hook. "Your sister cried herself to sleep last night. I hope you can live with that." Colleen sent me long messages about how hard she'd worked and how unfair her luck had been, and how family is supposed to mean something. My father sent nothing at all, which was, in its own way, the loudest message of them all. Not one of them, in all of those messages, across all of those days, asked how I was doing. Not one asked whether I was all right out there alone with a decision they'd dropped in my lap. They only reminded me, over and over, what I owed. I saved every message, screenshots one after another. Because I was learning, finally, at 42, that the people who are quickest to tell you what you owe them will always, eventually, write the whole ledger down for you in their own hand. I made my quiet preparations. I talked to Trudy, and I asked her to bring the folder on Christmas Eve. And I made one phone call to Dean Mercer about something I would need him for after the holiday, a thing I'll come to. And then I did something I almost never did. "I'm coming to Christmas this year," I texted my mother. She wrote back within a minute, delighted, full of warmth, certain she had won. Certain the strong one had come around at last, and the farm was as good as sold, and the family math was about to work one more time. I ironed the folder flat that night at my kitchen table and slid it into the inside pocket of my barn coat. The same coat they had been mocking for 10 years. The pocket with the safety pin. The one my mother always noticed and always mentioned. It felt right, somehow, that the truth was going to come out of the very thing they had used to decide I was nothing. On Christmas Eve, I drove the old truck to the house my grandfather built. The windows were gold with light. Cars lined the road on both sides. My aunts and uncles and cousins, 18 or 20 people who had spent years hearing the story of poor, foolish Faye and nodding along. I could hear the laughter through the front door, and a Christmas record playing, and someone's kids running. I stood on the step under my grandmother's old wreath and let my breath hang in the cold air, and I told myself the plain truth of it. Whatever they think is about to happen tonight, it isn't. I walked into that house as the daughter they thought they owned. I did not intend to leave as her. For the first hour, I let it be Christmas. I let it be gentle. I held Nora on my lap by the tree and admired the ornaments she pointed out. I let my mother touch my arm and call me sweetheart. Warmer to me than she'd been in years, because she thought I was there to save her. I said hello to cousins I hadn't seen since the last funeral. I let Colleen avoid my eyes across the room, and I didn't push. I ate my mother's dinner. I passed the rolls. I want you to know I gave them that hour. I gave them every chance to be a family before I let the truth into the room. Then, over dessert, my mother stood up and tapped her fork against her glass, and the room quieted, and she said she wanted to say something about family, about how, in hard times, families come together, and the strong ones carry the weak. And then she looked at me, and she said it, in front of everyone, with a soft and pitying smile. "We all know Faye made her choices," she said. "Poor Faye has nothing, but Colleen still has a future. So it's time we all take care of Colleen." She raised her glass toward my sister. Around the table, 18 faces turned to look at me, kind and pitying and expectant, waiting to see the strong one nod and do her part. My father stared down at the tablecloth. Colleen looked at me over the rim of her wine and let herself smile, just a little, because she thought it was already over. Nora looked up at her mother, then at me, confused, not understanding why the whole room had gone so still and strange. I set my own glass down on the table. I did not stand up. Somebody, one of my uncles, said gently into the silence, "Faye, honey, say something." So I said something. I said it quietly, across all those heads, to my father. "Dad," I said, "does everyone here know the house is mortgaged now?" The room didn't understand yet, but my father did. The color went straight out of his face, and his eyes finally came up to mine, wide and caught. Trudy reached down beside her chair and she opened her folder, and she laid the first page on the red tablecloth and slid it toward the center of the table where the light from the candles fell on it. A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Somebody's chair creaked. "That's private," my mother said. "Too sharp, too fast. That's between your father and me. It isn't a temporary thing, is it?" Colleen said, trying to get out ahead of it, trying to sound like the calm adult in the room. "It's just a misunderstanding. You're twisting it." "Then explain the foreclosure notice, Colleen," Trudy said, and laid the second page down. And the third. She set them out in a slow row on the tablecloth. The home equity line, $410,000 against my grandfather's house. The retirement statements, $300,000 pulled out early, penalty stamped after penalty. And the notice of default, my sister's own name printed across the top, the Brentwood house going under. The silence spread across that table like something quietly spilled. One by one, the faces that had turned to me in pity turned instead to my parents, and then to my sister, and the pity drained right out of them and left something colder and far more embarrassed in its place. My aunt on my mother's side set down her glass without a sound. My uncle pushed his chair back an inch, the way you do when you want to be just a little further from a thing. A cousin murmured something to her husband and went quiet. Nobody rushed to anybody's defense. That's the part I remember most. In a family that had defended Colleen her whole life, not one person opened their mouth to defend her now, because the pages were right there on the tablecloth, and you cannot argue with a number in ink. An older cousin of mine, a man who had spent years at these very tables calling me stubborn and calling Colleen a go-getter, reached out and picked up the home equity page. He read it. He set it back down slowly, like it had gotten warm in his hand. Then he looked at my father, and then he looked at me, and something in his face rearranged itself completely. I watched 16 years of a story come apart behind one man's eyes in the space of a single breath. And it was happening like that all the way around the table at once, quietly, in every face. And I said the only speech I was going to make. I kept it short, because I had learned that winter that the truth does not need to be shouted to land. It only needs to be said once, clearly, by someone who is finally done being afraid of it. You didn't come to my farm because I had nothing, I said. You came because you had already spent everything you had. On her. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my barn coat, the torn one, the one my mother had been telling me to replace for 10 years, and I took out the closing papers, and I laid them face down on the table beside the rest. I did not wave them around. I did not read the number out loud like a trophy. I just set them down where everyone could see there was one more truth in the room, and I left my hand resting on top of them. I sold the farm, I said. Weeks ago. I told no one. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For a long moment there was only the sound of the furnace kicking on, and the tick of the clock my grandfather had wound by hand for 40 years, and outside, faintly, the wind. And then Colleen broke, the way I had known someone would, because people like my sister cannot survive a silence that isn't about them. Her face twisted, and the whine and the fear and 16 years of being handed everything came up out of her all at once, before she could stop it. That money should be the family's anyway, she said, loud and ugly, her voice cracking on it. I deserve it more than a bunch of cows. Her fork came down hard against the edge of her plate with a crack. Down the table, Nora put both her small hands over her ears. My uncle stood all the way up now and stepped back from his chair and said, low and disappointed, Colleen. Nobody said. She didn't mean it. Everyone had heard exactly what she meant. My mother tried one more time to reach for the only word she had left. We are a family, she said, into the ruin of it. But it had no weight anymore. She had spent it, along with everything else. And everyone at that table had just watched her spend the last of it in front of them. My father put his face down into his hands. He did not deny a single page. He did not say it wasn't true, or that Trudy had it wrong, or that I was being cruel. He just sat there with his face in his hands, and that was his confession, made in front of every relative he had, without a single word. Just a man who could not lift his head. I did not gloat. I want you to understand that, because it matters to me. There was no triumph in that room for me, only a terrible, quiet clarity, like the stillness right after a storm has finally broken and moved off. I gathered the closing papers back up off the tablecloth and slid them into my coat. I stood up. I'll decide what I do with what's mine, I said, not you. I walked around the table to where Nora sat, wide-eyed and frightened by all of it, and I bent down and kissed the top of her head and told her it was all right, that none of it was hers to carry. And then I straightened up and looked at the room one last time. Merry Christmas, I said. I walked out through the kitchen, past the counter where I'd sewn 1,000 small hurts shut over the years. The screen door my grandfather hung swung shut behind me with a soft clap, and the cold came up to meet me, and the Christmas lights on the porch rail blinked red and gold against the dark. I got into the old truck. I set my hands on the wheel for a second before I turned the key. Then the engine caught, and the bad heater rattled to life, and I put it in gear. The room I had spent my whole life shrinking inside of, I finally drove away from. If you've ever had to stop making yourself small just to keep the peace with people who are supposed to love you, I hope tonight you feel a little less alone. What's the boundary you're still working up the courage to set? I'm listening. I read every one. The consequences came, the way they always do, in ways that no one could take back. Colleen lost the house. The foreclosure went through in the new year. cold and procedural, the tall Brentwood windows gone dark, a lockbox on the door where a seasonal wreath used to hang. Willow and sage closed for good. The sign in the window turned to closed, and then, a few weeks later, gone entirely. The shelves empty. Grant's income had dried up long before any of this, and without my sister's shine to stand behind, the marriage cracked down the middle and stayed cracked. The last I heard, they were still fighting over who owed what and to whom. My parents finally had to face the thing they had been running from for 2 years, the house payments they couldn't make, the retirement that wasn't there anymore, the $410,000 coming due on a home that had been free and clear for 2 decades, and a whole extended family that now knew, in exact and printed detail, how every bit of it had happened. The family that had spent years passing around the story of poor, foolish Faye stopped telling it. A few of them called me in the weeks after, awkward and late, to say they hadn't known, that they never would have gone along with it if they had. Some tried to apologize for years of nodding at that table. I let those calls stay short. I didn't need the apologies, and I wasn't going to hand out absolution I didn't feel, just to make anyone comfortable. But I noticed that the story had died. No one would ever tell it about me again. For a while, I let it all sit. I owed them nothing, and for the first time in my life, I let myself feel the full, strange weight of that word. Nothing. No debt. No obligation. No insurance policy left to collect on. But then a sign went up in the yard in front of my grandfather's house. Auction. And I found that I could not do it. Not for my parents, exactly. For him. For the man who had built that house with his own hands, who had never once in my childhood made me feel like the easy one or the spare, who had been gone 20 years and would have been ashamed of every single page in Trudy's folder. I called Dean Mercer, and I did the one thing I'd been quietly preparing for since before Christmas. I bought the house at auction, in my name, and then I put it into a trust, drawn up carefully, so that as long as it stood, it could never again be borrowed against or pledged or gambled away on any golden child, by anyone, for any reason. Then I drove out to the house and I set the old key down on my parents' kitchen counter in front of them. "You can live here," I told them. "Both of you, for as long as you need. But it will never be collateral again. Not ever." I did not hand a single dollar to Colleen. I want to be very clear about that. I secured my sister nothing, funded nothing, paid off nothing of hers. What she had broken, she was going to have to sit inside of and rebuild herself if she ever chose to. That wasn't cruelty. That was the first honest boundary I had ever drawn in my family, and it cost me my relationship with my sister, and I have not spoken to her since. Some days that still aches. I've made my peace with it aching. My mother, even then, even standing in that kitchen, reached for the old script. She talked about family and forgiveness, and how we all needed to move past this and be whole again. But the words had finally lost their spell over me. I could hear, at last, the difference between a person who is sorry for what they did and a person who is only sorry that it came out. And my mother, I understood, was the second kind. Her guilt was really just fear wearing guilt's coat. My father was different, though. He came out onto the porch one gray afternoon, while I was going over the trust papers at the little table, and he stood there a long time without saying anything, and then he did something he had never once done in 42 years. He went back inside, and he poured 2 cups of coffee, and he brought one out to me, his hands shaking a little, and he set it down in front of me on the table. "I should have asked how you were," he said. "Even once, in all those years. I should have asked." I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had emptied his own future rather than turn to his difficult daughter and simply ask her how she was doing. "It's a start," I said. And it was. Not forgiveness. Not all the way. Maybe not ever all the way. but a start, which was more than I'd had before. I let him keep his coffee after that. 1 cup for him and 1 for me whenever I came by. The first thing my father had ever given me that didn't require me to be strong in order to receive it. Trudy stayed exactly who she had always been, the one person in my family who never asked me for anything at all. She still comes by. There is always a thermos. I kept the house. I kept my aunt. I kept Nora, because I made very sure of it. I let go of the rest, and I'll tell you the honest truth. It was lighter than I ever imagined it could be. Setting a boundary that's right doesn't stop it from hurting. Both of those things are true at once, and anyone who tells you different hasn't done it. But underneath the hurt, for the first time in my life, there was air. And I hadn't felt air in a very long time. I didn't buy a bigger life with that money. I bought a quieter one. I found a smaller place. 100 acres this time. Nothing a developer would ever come circling for. Just good ground and a decent barn and a view I liked at the end of the day. I kept some cattle. Earl Dawson, who had worked beside me for years and never once treated me like anyone's fool, came with me, and he runs the place with me still. Nora comes out on weekends in her rubber boots, feeds the calves, fills the quiet with her talking. I set up a fund for her, quietly, through the same lawyer who drew up the trust, so that whatever her mother does or doesn't do in the years ahead, that little girl will get to choose her own life someday. She doesn't know about it yet. She doesn't need to. That one's just mine to carry, and it turns out to be a good weight to carry. Some evenings she and I sit on the tailgate of a newer truck, one whose heater works on the first try, and we watch the light go long and gold across ground no one will ever pave, and she tells me about her week. No one has to be strong for anyone out there. No one is keeping a ledger. It is the plainest thing in the world. 2 people on a tailgate at dusk, and it took me my whole life to find my way to it. Nora's drawing hangs framed in my new kitchen now, the yellow sun and the lopsided cows and Aunt Faye's happy place written across the top. On the counter beneath it there are always 2 clean coffee cups, waiting for whenever Trudy stops by. Here is what I learned, out on that quiet ground, the thing it took me 42 years and $39 million to finally understand. My worth was never the money. It was never how useful I could be to people who only reached for me when they were falling. They spent 16 years telling the whole family what I was worth, and then asking me to prove it by giving myself away for their sake. The silence I kept that winter was never a trick, and it was never revenge. It was the first time in my whole life that I chose myself. They spent 16 years deciding what I was worth. I spent 1 winter deciding it was never theirs to decide.